For the last couple of weeks, I have been trying to figure out the philosophy of this YouTuber, LiquidZulu. He is essentially a Rothbardian anarcho-capitalist who is a fervent proponent of Hans Hermann Hoppe's argumentation ethics, which attempts to prove the libertarian non-aggression principle through logical deduction. Today, we will go over Zulu's most viewed video, Anarcho-Capitalism, the Solution to Law. In it, he makes the following claim about the non-aggression principle.
It's the only legal ethic that can be proven to be true.
Right off the bat, he is violating Hume's law. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. His proof of argumentation ethics consists of 5 premises and a conclusion. Before we do any debunking, we're going to listen to his arguments in his own words, and then attempt to summarize them in their most basic form. His first premise is,
argumentation does not consist of free-floating propositions that don't come from anyone. Rather, argumentation is a human action requiring the use of scarce means.
Essentially, he is saying that, by definition, argumentation requires a person to engage in the action of arguing. Arguing is an action that can only be done with one's mind and body, which are scarce means, that is something that, when used, excludes other people from using it for a contradictory end. His second premise goes as following.
Argumentation does not exist in a normative void. There are certain norms that must be presupposed by anybody who engages in argumentation, such that the activity can even be recognized as being an argument. Let's imagine what it would look like without these presuppositions. Well, it would make argumentation lose any definitional significance, as literally any activity could be called an argument.
This just means that certain norms are always presupposed when engaging in argumentation. For example, one has to implicitly accept the norm that one ought to sometimes argue in order to make an argument in the first place. In his third premise, he claims that
the validity of any truth claim must be raised and decided upon within the course of an argument, so any normative presupposition of argumentation has the special status of being a practical precondition of ascertaining the truth or validity of anything whatsoever.
What he is saying here is that argumentation is the only way to find the truth of any claim. So consequently, the norms of argumentation mentioned in premise 2 need to be accepted to be able to make consistent truth claims in the first place. Moving on.
Fourth, to try and argumentatively dispute a normative presupposition of argumentation would be to contradict oneself. We call such a contradiction a dialectic contradiction.
Here he puts forth the idea that one would contradict themselves when arguing against the norms of argumentation. So consequently, any such argument would automatically be invalid, since contradictions are false. And finally,
fifth, argumentation is a conflict-free interaction. Interlocutors are not trying to convince the other through the force of their violence, but rather through the force of their arguments. Specifically, there is some dispute, and argumentation is a peaceful way of resolving that dispute. This means that one of the norms that would even make an interaction an argument in the first place is the NAP. So to try and dispute the NAP, one would contradict himself.
Zulu means that argumentation is, by definition, a non-violent interaction. Therefore, non-aggression is a norm of argumentation mentioned in premise 2, and arguing against it would be a performative contradiction as per premise 4. All of these premises culminate in his conclusion.
Therefore, the NAP is true.
Now, what is wrong with this argumentation? Long story short, everything. Long story long. His whole chain of argumentation is riddled with false premises, non sequiturs, and perhaps most importantly, is ought fallacies. To illustrate this, let's quickly go over his points in their most concise form, and maybe you can try to spot the fallacies yourself. As we go through these, you might realize that the premises are remarkably simple at their core, yet the way Zulu phrased them is unnecessarily convoluted. I'm not trying to imply that Zulu does this on purpose, but I do believe it's one of the main reasons why he and his followers haven't caught on to the fallaciousness of the argument. Sometimes the best way to debunk an argument is to simply make it as clear and simple as possible. Premise 1. Argumentation is a human action. Premise 2. Argumentation presupposes certain norms. Premise 3. Following the norms of argumentation is the precondition for finding truth. Premise 4. To argue against the norms of argumentation is contradictory, so the argument would therefore be false, and so therefore we ought to act in accordance with the norms of argumentation. Premise 5. The non-aggression principle is, by definition, a norm of argumentation, and so to argue against the NAP is contradictory, and so any argument contradicting the NAP would therefore be false, and so therefore we ought to act in accordance with the NAP. Conclusion: the NAP is true. So let's go over these one by one. Premise 1. Argumentation is a human action. Premise 1 is fairly uncontroversial and in my opinion not really needed. Zulu seems to think so as well because he often leaves out Premise 1 in other explanations of argumentation ethics. Premise 2. Argumentation presupposes certain norms. Premise 2 is also true, but the only norms one necessarily has to accept when making an argument are norms like, I ought argue at this time, arguing that no one else ought ever argue, or that they themselves ought never argue at any other point in time, would not be contradictory. We'll go into detail on that when we talk about Premise 5. Premise 3. Following the norms of argumentation is the precondition for finding truth. Premise 3 is where things get weird. Zulu seems to be claiming that debating is the only way of finding truth, which is just laughably untrue. For example, one can make true statements to themselves. One can make true statements to someone else without engaging in a debate. If we were driving and I told you the fastest way home, I could give you directions without engaging in a debate and still care about and be correct about the truth of the matter. So unless we really stretch the definition of debate to include literally any proposition, Premise 3 is a false premise. Let's say we did stretch the definition to include all propositions. This would also include propositions made to oneself, and that would not fit the definition Zulu uses in Premise 5, since he claims that you would have to accept the norm that you ought not aggress against other people when arguing. So in this case, he would be committing an equivocation fallacy. At this point, we should also remind ourselves that truth exists independently of argumentation. In other words, argumentation is not a truth maker in this context. Premise 4. To argue against the norms of argumentation is contradictory. Premise 4 might seem like a no-brainer at first. Of course, it is contradictory to argue against the norms of argumentation, but the implications drawn by Zulu are false. He claims that any argument that contradicts the norms of argumentation would automatically have to be false. Let's take Zulu's example to show why this isn't the case. He makes the following logical chain.
For instance, one could not consistently argue that nobody should ever argue, because to do this, they must first presuppose that they should be arguing in this situation. So we say that the proposition, people should never argue, is dialectically false.
To summarize his example, one could not consistently argue that no one should ever argue. Therefore, the proposition, no one should ever argue is false, and thus, people ought sometimes argue is true. Let's break this down. The claim people should never argue consists of two sub-statements, one stated explicitly and one implied. The explicit statement is, people ought never argue. The implied statement is, I, a person, ought argue right now, which itself implies the statement, people ought sometimes argue. So these two statements are indeed contradictory, and put together, they can be described as wrong, though in the context of dialectic contradictions, the term non-statement would be more fitting, since the proposer is negating their own claim with their actions. 1 minus 1 equals 0. The problem is that Zulu initially assumes two propositions are made to illustrate the contradiction, but then ignores the second proposition in his conclusion, by arbitrarily asserting that one is valid and the other isn't. Essentially, the negation of the combined statement, people ought never argue, and people ought sometimes argue, isn't people ought sometimes argue. If presented with this problem, Zulu's rebuttal would likely look something like this.
The negation doesn't make any sense, so it has to be that the negation of the negation, i.e. the original statement, is true.
He is saying that the reason one statement is valid and the other isn't, is that one can be argued without contradiction and the other can't. The statement, people ought never argue, will always be contradicted by its implication, while people ought sometimes argue is identical to its implication. So, Zulu appears to include a hidden premise in his argument, namely that something is false if it can't be argued for without contradiction. In my opinion, this should have been premise 1 instead of argumentation is a human action. However, Zulu seems to either think that this hidden premise is self-evident, or that it's implied by premise 3, so let's call it premise 0 to make things clear. But, is it correct? Are things that can't be argued for without contradiction necessarily false? To answer this, let's imagine a world where evolution has played out in a way that every time someone makes an argument, they experience unimaginable pain. In this world, the people would generally operate under the norm that they ought not make arguments. Arguing for that norm would still be contradictory, but as long as they don't make that argument, there is no contradiction. Consequently, the norm "I ought not argue" could not be argued for without contradiction, yet it would be, at least intersubjectively, true. If that thought experiment sounds too contrived to you, consider this analogy brought up in one of Zulu's debates.
Are you in a debate right now?
Yeah, I know that for a fact.
2 seconds later.
Could you be hallucinating?
Yeah, possibly.
2 seconds later.
If I were to claim that I'm not debating right now, that would contradict myself.
Can you answer my question?
And contradictions are false, so I know that I definitely am. I know that I am debating right now, because contradictions are false.
2 seconds later.
In the case of this debate, you could be hallucinating, right?
Yeah.
To make this perfectly clear, it could theoretically be true that you are hallucinating all your experiences and that you are the only person in existence. But arguing to other people that they don't exist is contradictory, since you would have to assume that they exist in order to argue in the first place. Thus, it could be true that you are the only person that exists, yet that truth couldn't be argued for without contradiction. In conclusion, if something can't be argued for without contradiction, that doesn't mean it's automatically false. To put it another way, it's not that something is wrong if it can't be argued for, but that something can't be argued for if it is wrong. Zulu is arbitrarily assigning significance to argumentation, but argumentation is not a truth maker in this context. So the first part of premise 4, namely, to argue against the norms of argumentation is contradictory, is correct. But the implication made by Zulu, namely, the argument is therefore false, is a non sequitur, and the hidden premise, things that can't be argued for without contradiction are false, is a false premise. What's more, the third part of premise 4 tries to bridge the is-ought gap by attempting to derive the prescription, don't contradict the norms of argumentation, from the descriptive statement, arguing against the norms of argumentation is contradictory, which ignores that prescriptive statements are in a different domain, a domain that doesn't allow for truth aptness. He's therefore committing an is-ought fallacy. In response to this critique, Zulu often brings up the following counter-rebuttal.
You just arbitrarily sliced out normative statements
it's
from
not arbitrary.
the domain of logic.
So he is saying that contradictions are false, so critics of argumentation ethics are arbitrarily excluding normative statements from the laws of logic. To show why this isn't the case, let's once again use Zulu's example of a normative dialectic contradiction and contrast it with an example of a descriptive dialectic contradiction. The statement, "no one should ever argue," implies the statement, "I think people ought to argue." The contradiction would therefore be with my own subjective beliefs. So anyone making that argument would be a hypocrite, but could be correct, as it doesn't conflict with reality, and hypocrites can be correct about that which they are hypocritical about. For example, a smoker could tell you that smoking is bad. In contrast, the statement, "I am not making a statement," implies the fact that I am making a statement. The contradiction would therefore be with reality, and the statement would be objectively false. Long story short, descriptive statements can be proven wrong by actions, prescriptive statements can't. The second implication of premise 4 is therefore an is-ought fallacy, and consequently another non sequitur, and his rebuttal is an equivocation fallacy, since he is equivocating descriptive and normative contradictions. Premise 5. The non-aggression principle is a norm of argumentation. To recap, Zulu says that argumentation is by definition non-aggressive, and therefore anyone who chooses to engage in argumentation is implicitly accepting the norm that disputes ought to be resolved peacefully. So, according to Zulu, the argument, "some disputes ought to be resolved non-peacefully," would always imply the statement, "disputes ought to be resolved peacefully," and would thus be contradictory, and thus false, and thus the NAP is true. We already went over why most of the inferences drawn by Zulu are incorrect, but even if we ignored all those fallacies, the argument still wouldn't make sense, as premise 5 is simply ridiculous. First of all, one does not necessarily have to accept the norm of non-aggression to engage in argumentation. For instance, I could very well believe that it's fine to aggress against you, but believe that arguing with you would be easier and safer. I could therefore be following something like the principle of hedonism or the principle of utility instead of the NAP, and hence there wouldn't be a contradiction. In other words, just because I engage in behavior that is by definition non-aggressive, this doesn't necessarily mean I implicitly accept the NAP. It would only mean I accept the NAP as a norm if I engage in this behavior because it is non-aggressive. But when I engage in argumentation, I could have other motives, for example, the avoidance of pain. Premise 5 is therefore a false premise. But even if we did have to necessarily accept the NAP in the context of argumentation, that doesn't mean that arguing for the initiation of force is contradictory, since we aren't universalizing that norm. To exemplify this, consider the following analogy. When I choose to eat a vegetarian meal, I only have to believe that I ought to eat vegetarian at this particular meal. So I don't automatically have to believe that eating meat is wrong. Similarly, the implied statement of any argument is, I ought not aggress against people in the context of this argumentation, not, I ought never aggress against people. The norm would only apply to that particular context, and therefore it would not be contradictory to say that anyone else ought to be aggressed against, or that the person they are arguing with ought to be aggressed against in a different dispute. To further illustrate why there is no contradiction, let's once again look at the statement, no one should ever argue. This statement is universal since it doesn't leave room for any instance where people should argue, and therefore the implied statement, people ought sometimes argue, which is not universal, contradicts with it. But neither the statement, some disputes ought to be resolved non-peacefully, nor its implication, this dispute ought to be resolved peacefully, is universal. So there is no contradiction, since both leave room for instances where the negation of their principle could be true. Therefore there would be no contradiction, and the first inference drawn from premise 5, namely, to argue against the NAP as contradictory, is a non sequitur. In response to this, Zulu has the following counter-argument.
I don't see how you can have any preference which isn't, in the moment, universal. You are showing that you prefer this thing right now.
His point is essentially that one actually does universalize the norm of non-aggression. Because whenever one engages in argumentation, one demonstrates a preference for peaceful conflict resolution for that particular point in time. So at any given point in time, we couldn't argue for both the avoidance and initiation of aggression. Consequently, we can't ever argue for conflict initiation, and the NAP would therefore be universal. This ignores that the NAP would not just only apply to that particular moment in time, but also to only that particular argument itself. In short, the NAP would only apply to the particular context of that particular argument. That is the context of trying to change that person's mind. It would, for instance, not be contradictory for me to try to argue why I should be the new owner of something you own while violently robbing you of that very thing, because the implied statement of my argument would be, I ought not change people's minds through violence. Not all disputes ought to be resolved peacefully. To make that example more realistic, imagine you try to steal a dog from someone who is unable to afford dog food because you know that the dog will starve unless he is rescued. Maybe you try to pull the leash from their grip, but then realize they are stronger than you thought, and so you attempt to argue with that person about why you should be the new owner of the dog. By engaging in violence, you aren't trying to change anyone's mind, but by arguing, you are attempting to change the owner's mind. So even if you'd have to accept the norm of conflict avoidance for that argument, it would only be applicable to the context of trying to change other people's minds, which is of course a redundant norm, as violently changing people's minds is impossible. Zulu's last rebuttal is therefore a non sequitur. Conclusion. So to recap, premise 0 is a false premise. Premise 1 and premise 2 are valid. Premise 3 is either a false premise or an equivocation fallacy. Premise 4 is valid, but the sub-conclusions Zulu draws from it are not. Namely, the argument would therefore be false, is a non sequitur, and we ought act in accordance with the norms of argumentation is an is-ought fallacy, and thus also a non sequitur. Premise 5 is a false premise, and the sub-conclusion, to argue against the NAP is contradictory, is a non sequitur. And because they are virtually identical to the sub-conclusions of premise 4, the other inferences of premise 5 fail for the same reasons. Namely, any argument contradicting the NAP would therefore be false, is a non sequitur, and we ought act in accordance with the NAP is an is-ought fallacy and therefore also a non sequitur. So unless you can mend all of those fallacies, the conclusion does not follow. Anyway, if you still believe in argumentation ethics after listening to this, I'd be very curious to hear your reasons in the comments below. Thank you for watching.